This lesson focuses on educational achievement and the link between social class and educational achievement, and we'll understand that link and evaluate some of the reasons. Before we move on to that though, this phrase, educational achievement, what does it mean for you? Pause the video and have some ideas. Okay, so when we say educational achievement, what do we mean? We mean the ways that we assess how well students do in school. So we mean data from SATs taken in year 2 and year 6, GCSEs taken in year 11, and A-levels that are taken in year 13. And we're looking at how well students achieve in those assessments. That's what we mean by educational achievement. Assessment is the test that they take, attainment is the grade that they get, and achievement is then that grade signifying educational success. And some argue that we should measure schools by exam results. There are league tables. Ofsted, when they come to look at schools, will look at how good their exam results are. Pause the video for a moment. Do you think we should measure schools by exam results? What are the reasons for and against? Okay, so let's see what you came up with. Many people argue it's good for parents to be able to see which schools are best. And that also makes the schools compete. They want to be top of the league table and the best around, so more parents send their children to those schools, and therefore they aim to do better. And that means the quality of education overall improves. Some people argue that looking at league tables does not provide an overall picture of the school, doesn't tell you how good the sport is, doesn't tell you how good the extracurricular is. Okay, there's different ways of measuring success as well. There are some people who manage through school to cope with some incredibly difficult things. That's not necessarily measured in exam results, but it's a huge success in their lives. And you can see it if you go and observe schools, but you can't see it in the exam results. So, the advantage, of course, of exam results is they give us quantitative data. We can look at patterns, we can look at trends. And in particular, we can look at patterns and trends related to social class. And by that, I mean the distinctions between those who are working class from a less well-off family background and those from middle class from a more well-off family background. Now, in theory, that shouldn't matter in the education system. The education system is supposed to be a meritocracy. Just to recap for you, the best metaphor for a meritocracy is the idea of a running race. Everyone has the same starting position, everyone travels the same distance, everyone's got the same goal. Those who are the best at running, those who've got the most ability, have worked hardest in training, will get the best result. In theory, school is supposed to be the same. Everyone comes to lessons at the same time, everyone does the same learning, everyone takes the same exams. We've looked at that before. Let's just recap that by answering this exam question. Explain how school can be seen as a meritocracy for students of all social classes. However your family background is, the school is the same for everybody. Pause the video and give yourself 3 minutes to attempt that exam question. Okay, so hopefully you wrote a P paragraph explaining meritocracy, maybe gave an example such as all the exams being the same or all the lessons being the same. But if schools really were a meritocracy, then what would we expect to see in the achievement of different social classes? Would students who were well off or from well-off families do better than other students? What do you think? Do you think they'd be the same? Because getting good grades has got nothing to do with how much money you have? Should they be different? Do you think working class students will achieve worse than middle class students? Do you think people from poorer backgrounds are naturally less smart? What do you think? This is an impossible question for anyone to answer because schools are not meritocratic. They don't work like that. They don't allow equality for everybody. Think back to the lesson we did on Marxism and their view that there are lots of hurdles that get in the way of people's success. And that's different for different people. People from a working class background might struggle, whereas people from a middle class background don't. That essentially is what we're going to be looking at in this lesson. Now then, in order to measure the link between social class and educational achievement, we need to have 2 bits of data. One is the achievement data. Well, we have that from the grades. The other is the social class of the students. But we don't have that. Students in schools don't know the social class background of the students or the parents, okay, of those students. However, we do have some information, which means we can sort of work out which students are more wealthy and which are less wealthy. Pause the video, see if you know what data schools have got that might give them clues? Well, there's a range of data, but the most effective one is free school meals. Certain parents are entitled to free school meals for their children. They have to apply to be allocated them, and schools know which students are on free school meals. So we can compare how students on free school meals do in tests against those who are not on free school meals. It's not a perfect comparison. If you're not on free school meals, that might be because you're only just too rich to be able to qualify for them. So you're not really got that much more money than the people who are on free school meals. Or you might be the richest person in the country. Just because you're not on free school meals, the school don't really know your family background. Also, maybe you're not on free school meals because your parents don't agree with them, don't believe in them, and don't want to claim them, even though they are entitled to. So it's not a perfect system. But we can compare data on free school meals with assessment data, and we get results like these. Only 53.5% of students entitled to free school meals achieve the expected level at the end of primary school. And under a third of children on free school meals get 5 good GCSEs at the end of year 11, whereas it's 3/4 amongst people from better off backgrounds. So that data gives you an idea that students on free school meals don't attain as well as students who are not. The other way we can find out information, well, we're sociologists. We can do some research, can't we? Halsey, who you need to know about, did some research sampling 8,000 men. And those 8,000 men, he asked them what their father's education was and divided them up into 3 groups. Those with professional fathers that he called the service class, those that he called the intermediate class, admin office workers, technicians, tradesmen, and then those he called the working class, manual labourers. Okay, those who did jobs that involved picking up heavy stuff and moving it around. And then he compared how well those 8,000 people did in terms of their father's education versus their own education. And he found a child whose father was in the service class was 11 times more likely to have gone to university than a child whose father was in the working class. So even though in theory those 2 children were running equal races in the education system because it was meritocratic, in actual fact the children from the service class were much more likely to succeed in that educational race and go on to university. Okay, I just want to check you've understood that data. So can you copy and complete this sentence? We know working class children achieve less well at school because, and use the information we've got here to answer that question and include at least some quantitative data in your answer. Pause the video to write that paragraph. Okay, so now you've understood that. Now we know that there is some data that shows there's a difference in educational attainment. We're now going to see if we can explain why. So let's think about stereotypical views of students who come from a working class background versus students who come from a middle class background. And just to be clear, we're not discussing the type of school here. We did that in a previous lesson, the comprehensive school versus an independent school. Assume these students go to the same school paid for by the government, but what do you think might be their differences in their education? I know these are just stereotypes, but they're just to start off your thinking. So have a think and write a list for each one. Pause the video to write a list. Okay, well, I'm sure you came up with some stereotypes, but maybe some of those stereotypes actually have some truth in them. Let's see what the research says in a minute. But I want you to first think about their home background. What is it when these students go home and when these students go home that might make a difference to how well they succeed in their exams and assessments? Can you come up with at least 4 differences in their home lives that might affect their exams? Try and write as many as you can when you pause the video. Okay, what ideas you come up with? Let's run through some of the sociological terms you need to know and see if you can link them to the points that you have identified. We're going to look at material deprivation, speech patterns, parents' attitudes, and cultural deprivation. Let's start with material deprivation. You need to write this definition down, please. Working class students are more likely to lack things due to their parents' inability to afford them. So they might have not got enough money to be able to go on trips. They might not have computers to work from home. They might not be able to pay for a tutor or a revision guide. They might not be able to afford the correct uniform. And in some schools, they might then end up in isolation because they haven't got the right uniform. But it was all because their parents didn't have enough money. If you noted anything like that on your list, next to it, can you write that that is an example of material deprivation? Anything to do with their parents not having enough money, that's an example of material deprivation. So add that to your list. Speech patterns. This is to do with the way people speak when they're at home. Middle-class students, middle-class parents are more likely to speak in a way of which teachers and exams approve. Okay, Bernstein argued this, that correct grammar is something that middle-class parents might have learned themselves when they went to university. They might use it when they talk in the family. Students might use it when they talk in their family, and therefore they use it when they write in their essays at school. If you got a family from a working class background, maybe they never learnt that kind of grammar. They never learnt those speech patterns. Maybe they don't learn as many words or terms because they didn't go to university themselves. They didn't need to. They don't use them at home. You're not exposed to them when you're at home. So the only time you learn them is when you're in school. So then learning them in school becomes a big part of your learning these words, learning how to write them. For other students, they don't need to learn that. They already know it. And they can use their cognitive load, their learning ability, to learn the history or the sociology or whatever they're studying. Okay, learn the book that they're reading. They're not having to also at the same time learn language and how to write and grammar because they learnt it at home. That might make a difference as well. That's what Bernstein argued. So if you had anything to do with language and writing, note that down in your list as well. Maybe it's not just about how people speak, but how they think. Working class parents are sometimes considered to be less likely to see education as important. It's not necessarily a criticism, and sometimes it can be controversial to think that, but the idea is basically if your parents are middle class, they probably succeeded in education themselves, did well, went to university, and because of that, they've got a high class job. So therefore, they see education as important. If your parents are working class, maybe they didn't succeed much at school, and the success they've had has come later in life by working hard when they're at work. So they don't necessarily see school as that important. They'd rather you were doing really well in your part-time job than you were doing really well in your homework. And that might mean they don't encourage you as much or help you as much or push you as much as a middle-class parent might. And lastly, cultural deprivation. That's to do with different social attitudes and different norms and values that you might have in different families. Working class families are less likely to have norms and values that fit with the education system. So things like it's really good to read regularly. Students who come from families where that's a value do better in school. If when you were a young child, everyone reads in your family. Older brother and sister read, your parents read, you're given a book, you're taught to read when you're young. That's what everyone does in your family. Then when your teachers say to you, okay, we're studying and inspector calls, here's the book, go away and read it. It fits in with your norms and values of your family anyway. If that's not what your family values, if it's no, we don't do reading, we do something else. We go to the gym and we lift weights, that's what we do as a family, then fine, great, nothing wrong with that. But then when you have to read books for your English exams, it's new to you and it's something extra you've got to do and you might not do as well. Okay, so therefore anything linked to the norms and values of your family and how will they match with what you're doing in school, that is an example of cultural deprivation. Make sure you've written that term down as well. So question for you, which of these best explains why working class students achieve less well than middle class students? Those students whose parents are entitled to free school meals, why don't they do as well in school? Is it because that lack of money, which is why they're entitled to free school meals, also means they can't afford equipment, computers, tutors? Is it because their parents will speak a different language or have a different attitude or have different norms and values from the education system? And therefore, education and home are very different and it's harder to achieve the highest grades. Pause the video and have a think. Maybe someone in your family or a peer you can communicate with who's also studying sociology, have a debate with them as well. Okay, so we've looked at some key explanations for working class underachievement. Just want to run through and sum them up again. This is quite a good comparison slide. Firstly, there's the lack of money, okay, whether it's for trips, uniform, equipment. Might also be that as you get older, you have to have a part-time job to support your family. and that gets in the way of studying for exams. So that's material deprivation. Something we didn't discuss on the previous slide, because I didn't necessarily expect any of you to have guessed it, but that some sociologists have argued is relevant, is the idea of school choice. That middle-class parents can make better choices about which school to send their children to. Remember those league tables that rank which school is the best? Well, if you understand how they work, if you've got knowledge of how the education system works, you can work out which school is best. If you could afford the transport to send your child to a school further away just because you've worked out it's better, or the fees to go to an independent school, or even to buy a house near to a good school, then you can get your children into better schools. And this is important, by the way. When you get older and you look at buying or renting houses, you'll find that houses that are near to good schools cost an awful lot more than houses that are near to bad schools. And so it's middle-class parents who can afford those good schools. Parental interest, we discussed that, parents supporting their children. The language that they use, we discussed that. Also, working class children are more likely not to have English as their first language, which will affect their educational attainment. We discussed culture. I used reading as a previous example. Working class children are also less likely to visit museums, to go on foreign holidays, and they have less wider knowledge. It's called cultural capital than middle class children have. Maybe you're studying a book for school in English and something happens to the character. Well, the more wider knowledge you've got, the more understanding you're going to have about what that character is doing and what it means to them, and the better marks you're going to get when you write about that book. Similarly, if you go into an exam and there's an extract there you've never seen before, you've got to analyse the language in it, you're more likely to know what's going on in that extract if you've got more wider knowledge, because you've got more cultural capital, because your family can afford to take you to foreign countries, to learn about the world, to visit museums, and so on. And lastly, think about primary socialisation, the way children are brought up. Children in working class families, many working class parents are absolutely fantastic parents, but those families are more likely to experience problems that affect the children's primary socialisation. They're more likely, as we'll see in a later topic, to be victims of crime. They're more likely to have to work two jobs, and so they don't have the time to look after their children and bring them up as well as they'd like. So all those things can be relevant. So we've asked you which of these factors you think is most significant. What does the research say? Well, remember Halsey, who did his research, he identified 3 factors. Firstly, he said material deprivation mostly impacted the money for uniform and trips, and not being able to go on trips held back the working class students' education. Secondly, for him, parental engagement. He looked at how much time parents were able to spend helping their children with their homework. A middle class parent who perhaps doesn't have to work such long hours, or who's got the educational background themselves to help with the homework, is able to spend more time supporting the student. And lastly, he looked at school choice. And remember the distinction from a previous lesson about grammar schools that select by ability versus comprehensive schools that don't. It won't surprise you to learn that grammar schools, because they select the smartest students, get the best exam results. There are more grammar schools in middle class areas. So middle class families are more likely to be able to get their children into schools with higher grades. So these are the factors that Halsey identified from his research. The other researcher you need to know is Ball. Ball identified school choice. This idea that you can read the Ofsted report and find out how good a school is. You can look up the school's exam results and work out how good they are. You can do your research into whether the results have been getting better over the last 5 years or getting worse over the last 5 years, whether they've had a new head who've improved the results. All of those factors are things you can look up if you've got the knowledge and the contacts to do so. Ball argued middle class parents had that knowledge, therefore they could find the best schools, send their children to them, and their children got better grades because they were in better schools. And the working class families just had to send their children to the local school. It might not be as good, and therefore the children on average don't get as good grades. So you need to know what Ball and Halsey identified. You also need to know these key terms. Remember, material deprivation, the inability to afford goods and services, and cultural deprivation, the inability to provide language skills and motivation, and that covers all these areas of interest, cultural capital, language, and socialisation. Just like you to pause the video and make sure you've got these down. We're using these definitions, please, to write down material and cultural deprivation, the definition, and then use the pictures in the slide to help you fill in some examples. It's going to leave you to pause the video and copy and complete that table. Okay, so I'm glad you've got that down. This slide then is also a nice summary slide to help you with your revision. When you're going back over this topic to revise, this is probably a good one because it's got the research, the definitions, and the examples there for you. Okay, let's try some exam questions then. 3 marks, describe material deprivation as a cause of working class underachievement. So explain what it is, use some key terms and give an example. The same for cultural deprivation. And then a research item question for you. Albert Halsey and his partners, Heath and Ridge, sampled 8,000 males. There's some information. What does the research in item A show about working class underachievement in education? Okay, read that data and can you identify what the research shows and explain what it means? And there's an extension there for you. So give yourself about 8 minutes, pause the video and try those questions. Off you go. Okay, so to mark your work then, hopefully with these 3 markers you identified a P paragraph, the definition, explanation and an example. And here, what does it show? Working class children 4 times less likely to be at school at 16. This is when you could leave before then. 10 times less likely to be at school at 18. What does that show them? It shows them that they haven't got the grades to move on to the next level of education, and therefore it's an example of working class underachievement. And all this is really important because it influences government policy. If we know what is holding these working class students back, then the government can do something about it. So those who believe that it was all to do with material deprivation and lack of money to pay for things like computers or tutors at home, well, they're the kind of people who, when they were in charge of the country, invested a lot of money in providing computers at schools, libraries that are open after school where students can do their homework, intervention after school for those doing exams to make up for the fact they can't afford tutors. Okay, because the government thought that was the problem, so therefore that was the solution. If you don't think that's the problem, if it's all to do with the language your parents use or how much they've taught you to care about education, then those things aren't going to make that much difference. So by sociologists figuring out what the cause is, helps governments figure out what the solution is. So pause the video, have a think. What do you think is the one thing the government could do to help working class students achieve? Okay, so let's move on. I'm just going to show you some more statistics about social class and educational achievement. Which one worries you most? Which one surprises you most? You've learnt that at the end of their education, when they do their exams, working class students don't do as well as middle class students. But it's also true they're less likely to attend a nursery or preschool. They're more likely to start school unable to read. They're more likely to be put in the lower set or lower stream. They're more likely to get fewer GCSEs and low grades. And they're less likely to take A-levels. Pause the video and discuss which is the most worrying and most surprising of those statistics. Okay then, so we know there's a link between social class and educational achievement, and we've looked at the reasons and we've evaluated them. To get the high grades, you need to be able to use evidence from official statistics and from Halsey's research, and you need to use concepts like material deprivation, cultural deprivation, and you also need to be able to use Ball and Halsey's research to help look at the causes of that underachievement. Here's the essay you've got to write. Discuss how far sociologists agree that cultural deprivation is a more significant cause of working class underachievement than material deprivation. So firstly, secondly, some explanations about why cultural deprivation affects working class students. On the other hand, about the material deprivation, and can you criticise the view with which you disagree? If you're going to conclude cultural deprivation is the most important, maybe you want to say, it doesn't matter if you've got a computer at home. The school library's got one, you can use one there. Material deprivation doesn't matter. Or if you're going to say it's all about material deprivation and cultural deprivation doesn't matter, then again you want to say, it doesn't matter whether your parents care about school. You still have to go to school. You still get given the same homework as everybody else. You still get made to do the homework. So if you're not achieving, it's got nothing to do with your parents' attitudes, really. it's got to be something to do with the lack of money they've got. Okay, and here's a structure that can help you plan your answer. Firstly, what is your answer going to be? Are you going to argue cultural deprivation is more important or that material deprivation is more important? Remember, you get higher marks if you can argue towards a conclusion than if you can just explain both sides. So the best essays are going to explain cultural deprivation brilliantly, explain material deprivation brilliantly, weigh them up and come to a conclusion. But an essay that explains cultural deprivation, material deprivation, okay, but not great, but then weighs them up and comes to a conclusion, is going to get more marks than one that explains both brilliantly, but just separately, with no evaluation, no conclusion at all. So, which side are you going to say is the best? And what are going to be your reasons for saying cultural deprivation matters and your reasons for saying material deprivation matters? Probably want to think about having at least 2 points on one side and at least 1 on the other side. Whichever way around you do it, doesn't really matter. And what concepts can you put into your answer? Okay, can you write about some of the other things you've learned when studying education? Meritocracy, role allocation, universal standards, particularistic standards, secondary socialization. All of these things are part of the education system. So you can write about all of them when it comes to evaluating which of these is most significant. And if you can use statistics, Halsey, and Ball, then you can earn higher marks as well. Okay, so what I suggest you do is you pause, you plan the essay, then you give yourself 12 to 15 minutes to write the essay. And if you can do it, you'll be evaluating the link between social class and educational achievement using the terms and the research that you've learnt, and you'll be earning the high marks. Pause the video, plan and write your essay. Okay, if you've done that successfully, then you've successfully completed today's learning objectives. Congratulations and well done.